Hello, travelers. Boardman21 here, and today is skill discussion number 4, and we're going to be talking about Smelter's Wrath. We're going to build it a few different ways. We're going to talk about some of the pros of it, some of the cons, and then we're going to give a whole bunch of suggestions on how we think that it could be made better and more viable, as it's one of the underutilized skills, and yet it's one of the funnest to play because it leads to such a big explosion. Alright, let's go ahead and get into it. Alright, let's start with some pros. Smelter's Wrath is actually a really cool skill. It's got a huge amount of AoE, especially if you build into Nova. If you just build into the cone attacks, it's not such a big AoE. You know, it's pretty small cone, and even if you have it going out both sides, it's very directional and you're charging in the one direction, so if mobs move or come in from other directions, you're kind of stuck, gotta release early, don't get the maximum damage type thing. But the skill tree itself has a lot of good options. You have your critical strike section, you have your Nova section, you have your repeat an attack on the opposite side section, you have a furnace, some secondary procs, you got your axes and your volleys, and you can get into some throwing damage with it, and the furnace is actually a spell type with it, so if you're building around spells, you can get into some spell types of it. But overall, it's got quite a few choices. It's also a channeling skill, so you have the normal like speed up and slow down and things like that. You can get more ignite damage per ignite stack that's on an enemy, which is pretty cool. It kind of synergizes with Rive a little bit with the whole converting ignite chance into physical damage and such. So some of the cons for this skill is if you think of any other sort of channeling ability that's highly used, such as Disintegrate or Warpath, you have channeling Elemental Nova, something like that that's channeled. The benefits that those skills have, and one of the reasons why they're used, even though Smelter's Wrath can hit for more damage, is that they have a constant supply of damage going out, which makes it very easy to change targets, hit multiple targets, and that also means for survivability purposes, they're leeching a lot more. They're leeching constantly. With Smelter's Wrath, you can go for 1.6 to over 2 seconds in between hits. That's a long time with how fast the attack speeds get, how fast enemies get, and how many hits you're taking in this game. And even being a tanky Forge Guard and having all of the passive abilities of the more times you're hit, doing more melee damage and having more armor and things like that, it's still not enough to make it super playable. You can play it, and it does work, but unfortunately you die a lot more because you're taking so many hits and you're not having any source of regen from leech that it's hard to keep up. Now you can play it as a health regen class and have your survivability depend on how much health you're regenning, but things like health on hit and health on kill, leech, everything that comes with hitting enemies, which leech right now is more powerful than any other form of health regeneration, it really makes it not compete with the top end builds. So it would be awesome if there were more ways for you to get damage put out faster, even if it means doing less damage. And I know that you could say, well, you don't have to charge it for the full amount of time, you could just sit there, but then the other con is it has a cooldown, so you can't completely just reuse it. You have something like Elemental Nova that can hit in almost a big enough circle to compete with Smelter's Wrath at maximum charge. Not quite as big, but if you fully min-max a build, you can have a huge area with it. And it's attacking 5 times per second and doing a lot of damage with each of those hits. And then you have Smelter's Wrath, which is doing 1 hit per 2 seconds, which is ridiculous. Now, we'll get into the builds and we'll go into some more of the suggestions on how to change it, but just quickly, the Furnace as well, which is a secondary proc, does do pretty good damage if you build in with like a scepter instead of a two-hand, or get some adaptive spell damage, and it allows for you to attack enemies while you are charging up the skill. But unfortunately you can't build it into a Nova, and it only goes one direction. Now if they could have that follow your mouse or turn that into a Nova as well, so you have some sort of leech coming in while you're charging, so kind of a small fire going while you ramp up the big hit, that would be awesome. But we'll go over that more in the build section. The other cons that I have for this build, which really isn't much, the mana cost is okay, but mostly it's just the cooldown and the fact that it takes so long to attack no matter how you build it. It doesn't scale with attack speed, you can't charge it faster other than the one node that they give you for it, and there's no real options to get a lot of leech coming in while you're charging it. Those are pretty much the cons that I have for it. But let's go ahead and start getting into the builds, and let's start with build number 1. For build number 1, I call this the try option. It allows you to build into spell, it allows you to build into throwing, and to build into melee, and it's all going to do pretty good damage, but you're not really built into doing just one of them, so you're not maximizing upon like a big hit. The way that I built this tree is going to have 4 points in Blacksmith's Breath, 1 point in Backdraft, so you'll have 2 cones coming out, 2 points in Heavy Strike, 1 point in Furnace, 5 points in Weight Stone, 1 point in Bright Smith, 3 points in Valiance, 2 points in Final Strike, and 1 point in Axe Volley. And so what this is going to do is you're going to channel it, you're going to have 2 cones come out, and then the 1 cone that you're pointing towards, your forward cone, not your back cone, but your forward cone, is also going to get the Furnace, which is going to do some spell fire damage over time, so it'll be attacking every second. And then you'll have the Axe Volley when you release it, so you'll have a big hit, and then you'll have a bunch of axes come out. Now, I'm going to go ahead and show you what it looks like, then we'll go over the tooltip DPS and the problems, the things that I have with this. But for the most part, let's face this way first. I'm going to go ahead and have my Furnace going, and then once you explode, you'll see you release the 5 axes, and you also have the back cone, which will attack enemies behind you. And if you look at the damage we're doing, your damage over time is only doing about 8. Your Furnace hit for about 300, so you can see there's a huge discrepancy. Remember, we're naked, we don't have passives except what we needed to unlock the skill tree, but none of them relate to damage. And then you have the Axe Volleys that come out and do damage in between what the spell damage was hitting for and what your Smelter's Wrath hit for. So to get into the tooltip DPS of this, just to show you, the tooltip DPS of Smelter's Wrath is 89 damage per second. Now remember, this is completely naked. We're not wearing any weapons. You have no added melee damage, and you also have no adaptive spell damage, and you have no throwing damage. So this is just what the base of these are. Now throwing damage should naturally be higher because you don't get to add as much throwing damage as you do melee damage or adaptive spell damage. So the other two should be higher. Now if you look, you have 89 damage per second. If you go to your Axe Volley and you look at the damage that it does, it has 63 damage per second, which isn't bad. That just about puts it on par with how much damage Smelter Wrath is going to do, which is pretty good for something we haven't built into any of the more hit damage, which you can do if you want to specialize into it. And remember, we don't have hit damage and all of that inside of the passive trees as well. So it's pretty good damage for the Axe Volleys. The problem with the Axe Volleys is that they go off after you've released the charge. So Smelter Wrath already does its hit, and then you're hitting with the axes afterwards. And Smelter's Wrath can hit hard enough that you're already one-shotting everything. So the axes are kind of pointless. It would be cooler if you shot the axes out while you were channeling up, and perhaps even in other directions other than just the direction that you're already coning to do, because you're already going to do damage there. And then you have the Furnace, and the Furnace, which looks cool, it takes about the same coat shape, and then it does its damage over time, which would be really nice to leech things in, but you have to build into spell and adaptive spell damage, and unfortunately its damage is 18 per second. It's absolutely horrid. It's bad. I've even built completely into it with a two-handed staff, and the Furnace does not do good damage. And unfortunately, for both of these things, even when you take the Backdraft and you cast the Smelter's Wrath in a cone shape forward and behind you, they only go with the forward direction. So if you take both directions or you take the cone, they don't get the cone effect or the dual cone either, which is another sad thing. Like, it would be cool if those effects would, go along and synergize with both Backdraft and synergize with Detonation. So for build number 1, basically you're still going to be using Smelter's Wrath melee damage for all the damage you do, but you get some cool secondary procs that look cool, but they're not super useful. So let's go ahead and do some more builds and build into those specifically and see what kind of damages that we can get out of them. For build number 2, we're going to build straight into the Axe Volley, and we're going to build completely into it, taking the 5 points and bury the hatchet. Now the reason I haven't put those 5 points in yet is because these points in here don't actually change the DPS tooltip for it, and I wanted to prove that it actually does do more damage once you take it. So for starters, with this build we have 3 points in Blacksmith's Breath, 5 points in Weight Stone, 1 point in Bright Smith, 3 points in Valiance, 2 points in Final Strike, and 1 point in Axe Volley, and then we will have 5 points in Bury the Hatchet. And when you use it this way, you're only going to have the 1 cone. It's going to be in front of you, and you'll notice that when we did that, our Smelter's Wrath hit for 400 damage, and the Axe Volleys hit for about 38 damage, which is pretty horrible, especially when you compare that that's 1/10. It's hitting for 10% the damage that Smelter's Wrath is. Like 10%. Come on now. That's horrible. That's such a big discrepancy in damage. And remember, we don't have anything on. Now, for Smelter's Wrath, we're going to go ahead and throw those 5 points in. Now you're making the axe volleys do 200% more damage. We're going to go ahead and fire again. And when we do it, you'll notice that you hit again for about 400 damage with Smelter's Wrath. You hit for 100 damage with the axe volley. That's incredible that with 200% more hit damage with it, you're still hitting for 25% of the damage that you're just getting for Smelter's Wrath, which makes you wonder which way you're really going to build it. Now you could argue, well, it's a secondary proc, it's not supposed to do that much, whatever, but it's the fact that Smelter's Wrath is already hitting first and the volley follows, so why would you want the hit that does last to apply less damage? Either way, I think it needs a big boost of damage, and many other things that I'd like to see for Axe Volley is that it can go off more than just after Smelter's Wrath. I'd like it to be able to go off per second that you're channeling, or even every half second while channeling. I would like it to be thrown towards a nearby enemy, and then the final one, the final axe volley at the end with 5 axes, actually all go forward in your cone, but while you're actually channeling, every half second you throw an axe into a random direction towards a nearby enemy. And of course, those can proc smite, those are throwing attacks, so if you built into smite as well, it does mean you can get some smites raining down, which would be really cool to get some smites raining down to give some more flat added fire damage while you're actually channeling Smelter's Wrath to make it do even more damage as you sat there and built up. Alright, let's go ahead and move on to build number 3, the Furnace. For build number 3, we're going to go ahead and build into the Furnace and its increased damage, and we're going to see how that works with the build. And once again, I left the 5 points out of Bellows because it doesn't affect the actual DPS tooltip, so I just wanted to prove that it does do more damage once you put points into that. And for beginners, the first thing I do want to point out is for Bellows, this increases Furnace damage. It increases damage by 200%, whereas with the axes you got 200% more damage. So that already is a big no-no. I mean, that's the only way to increase the damage, and now you have increased versus more. Why there's a separation between those two, I don't know. It already lacks base damage. It's even with a two-handed staff that you put on that has more adaptive spell damage than it does melee physical damage, it will actually increase the tooltip for the furnace, or for Smelter's Wrath, more than it will the Furnace, and you'll be able to get thousands of damage in a critical strike with Smelter's Wrath, and you'll be doing 200, 300 damage with the Furnace, which is just ridiculous that even with a two-handed staff with a massive amount of 100 adaptive spell damage, you're not going to do that good of damage with it, which just makes it a really bad secondary proc. But it looks really cool, and I really like it for that. So let's go ahead and start off with just going ahead, hitting this once, see the damage we do. We are doing 8 damage every tick that we have that for. 8 damage per tick compared to the 400 damage hits that you're getting with the actual skill. So you're doing, what is that, like 2% of the damage? It's just ridiculously low. And then if we fully spec into it, we'll put the 5 points in Bellows. All these other ones are just for armor shreds, slow chance, ignite chance. None of those are going to increase the amount of damage you're doing with the Furnace. But we're going to do the 200% increased damage, and if you look at the tooltip, it's still going to say 18 damage per second. That's what it's been at. And then when we go to do an attack, we go on, and we are now doing 22 damage. That's right, 22 damage. Compared to a 400 damage hit you're getting with Smelter's Wrath when you're not even building around into that, which is ridiculous. I mean, you're talking about 5% of the original damage, which is just ridiculously low, and it's one reason why it's just not utilized very much. It should have some more modifiers. I really wish that while you're channeling, that it would follow your mouse, so you could hit enemies around you. I wish if you took the Nova, that you could make the Furnace apply in a Nova, so kind of like the fire golems when they have their life turned down to half and they do that aura, they have that flame explosion. That'd be really cool if you could do that with Nova. I would like for Smelter's Wrath by itself, when you fully channeled, if you don't release, that it starts doing that, kind of like the aura damage where it's hitting all of the time. It would really help be able to leech more, and the more you stay in one spot, maybe even increase its damage. Be very effective against bosses, and of course in echo runs it wouldn't matter very much because you don't need to stay in one spot. You're constantly trying to move, so it would only, it would help against bosses, and you'd have the normal kind of gameplay that you have during echoes right now. But for the Furnace, It just needs more base damage. It needs better ways to scale, maybe scaling with the skill tree itself more. And of course, I would like the UI of it to be able to follow your mouse cursor while you're channeling, and to be able to follow the procs of the secondary cone and the Nova shape. And then for build number 4, I call this one the Explosion, and this is the normal way I'd build it. We're not building into any secondary procs, we just want to build into a lot of hit damage with the skill itself. And with this way, I've got 5 points in Weight Stone, 1 point in Brightsmith, 2 points in Valiance, so we'll do extra more hit damage against rares and bosses, 3 points in Forge Scale, 1 point in Detonation, 1 point in Crucible, so we're now going to get the Nova, and then when we also fully charge in that Nova area, we'll leave behind a Burning Patch, which will ignite enemies. That's a very important, which we'll get into here in a second. Remember, that lasts for 6 seconds, and it ignites every second. Then we have 2 points in Blacksmith's Breath, 2 points in Stinging Steel. This will basically guarantee that you have a critical strike chance. You don't even need to build into Volcanic Mastery. I think it's been proven that this is bugged, but that's just a temporary bug report on the forums. Other people have said it's not, but you do definitely have some crazy critical strike chance that happens once you take into the Stinging Steel. 2 points into Heavy Strike, and then 1 point in Tempering Blows, and this gives more hit damage per ignite stack on the enemy, 15% each, up to 10 stacks for 150% more damage, which is huge. And remember, you're getting all of that ignite from Crucible, which will leave the ground burning, and it's going to let you ignite the enemy every second. You can get multiple stacks of this on the ground, which means once you've ignited or used the skill twice in the same area, enemies in there are going to start getting to that cap of 10 stacks of ignite as those start to fall off. And what's cool about that is it means that you don't have to hit the enemy with something else like Rive or any other sort of skill. You can just keep using Smelter's Wrath over and over again, and your enemy's going to have that 150% more hit damage hitting it because of how many ignite stacks are on them. And then for the tooltip DPS on this, it is still going to be 89 damage per second for the tooltip, and mostly that's because everything that we added is damage that you're going to get if they're ignited, if you've channeled for a more longer period of time. So even though this damage per second is low and it only says 89 per second, you're still going to get 1,000 damage crits. That's one of the reasons that tooltips can't really be trusted for a lot of things. But as we go into this, let me go ahead and show you. So we're going to go ahead and channel it. Now remember, it does cost quite a bit of mana, but at this point, we've now have the Burning Patch, we're applying Ignite. Now you do another one, and boom, you can see that you're getting even more ignites. You got 2 burning patches, and as you do this, you're going to see that your crits hit absolutely really hard. Even our regular damage is hitting harder, but you're getting almost 2,000 damage crit hits at this point, which is a ridiculous amount of damage to be doing with a skill completely naked. We're talking nothing on, no passives, anything. That is a lot of damage. Alright, that's going to be it for this skill discussion. Those are the pros, cons, and suggestions that I have, along with some different ways to build the skill, and how in each of one of those it would be better if it had, you know, a secondary proc that was more damaging, or was able to give you more leech, or kill trash mobs as they came at you, and things like that. If you have any more suggestions, feel free to comment them below. Also, as soon as this is posted, there will also be a teaser for a build based around Smelter's Wrath, and then there will also be, of course, the 5th skill discussion poll for you to vote on. So as always, stay safe, travelers.